Hello and welcome to the Dailies. International media attention today ranged widely from U.S. military action in Nigeria to rising tensions in the Caribbean, where expanded patrols and diplomatic friction have underscored Washington's tougher regional posture. Alongside breaking geopolitical developments, many outlets published end-of-year roundups reflecting on 2025's defining crises and power shifts. Christmas coverage also featured prominently, with front pages carrying seasonal messages, political statements and symbolic gestures from world leaders marking the holiday. International media focused on U.S. strikes on ISIS in Nigeria, while American media framed the strikes as counter-terrorism actions shaped by U.S. domestic politics. Coverage stressed Trump's focus on protecting Christians and evangelical pressure, while noting that violence in Nigeria is complex and not purely religious. The New York Times outlines in its explainer the background and consequences of the recent U.S. airstrikes in northern western Nigeria, framed around President Trump's claims that Islamist militants are actually targeting Christians. The piece reviews Trump's threats also to cut aid and use force, Nigeria's rejection of those accusations, and the administration's escalation through military action. The explainer adds essential context on Nigeria's complex violence landscape, showing how religious, ethnic, and also criminal conflicts intersect, while noting the lack of clear evidence supporting Washington's central justification. The New York Times also offered a clear, comprehensive overview of the Islamic State's evolution from a territorial caliphate to a decentralized global threat. The explainer effectively traces ISIS' origins, decline in Iraq and Syria, and also resurgence through affiliates, particularly in Africa and also Asia. By distinguishing between directed, enabled, and inspired attacks, the piece adds analytical depth while grounding its narrative in recent high-profile violence. It underscores why ISIS remains a persistent security concern despite military defeats. The Guardian argues that Trump's decision to strike Nigeria was shaped less by a clear-cut humanitarian emergency than by U.S. domestic politics. The piece highlights how conservative media, evangelical groups, and Republican lawmakers have long amplified claims of Christian persecution in Nigeria, turning the issue into a rallying cause for Trump's base. It also contends that although framed as protecting Christians, the strikes reflect political signaling at home, even as analysts and Nigerian officials stress that the country's violence is far more complex and not solely religious. The Wall Street Journal offers a detailed, high-stakes account of the U.S. Coast Guard's pursuit of the sanctioned oil tanker Bella 1, framing it as a flashpoint in Washington's escalating crackdown on illicit oil networks tied to Iran and also Venezuela. The piece explains the legal basis, the military preparations, and the risks of boarding a hostile vessel on the high seas. It also situates the chase within broader geopolitical pressure on Nicolas Maduro and Iran's shadow fleet. And as the year draws to a close, many publications turn to end-of-year roundups reflecting on the defining political, economic, and cultural stories of 2025. These pieces assess major global trends, key leaders, conflicts, and also social shifts, while also looking ahead to the challenges and priorities expected to shape 2026. Foreign policy frames 2025 as a turbulent turning point in U.S.-China relations, marked by tariff escalations, uneasy truces, and widening strategic mistrust. The roundup shows how Trump's return amplified volatility across trade, technology, education, and also security, while exposing China's leverage and accelerating Beijing's push for self-reliance. It concludes that rivalry has hardened into a defining feature of global politics, costly, unstable, and also increasingly detached from the everyday interests of ordinary Americans. Foreign policy also presents 2005 as a watershed year for Gen Z-led protest movements, challenging assumptions about youth apathy. The piece traces how economic pressure, corruption, and also digital organizing fueled rapid uprisings across the global south, toppling governments in places like Nepal, Peru, and Madagascar. The piece balances optimism with caution, stressing that while protests proved powerful, sustaining influence after victory remains the hardest test for young movements, navigating entrenched institutions and military power. In the US, Christmas coverage focused mainly on political messages, with leaders using holiday greetings to promote their views, attack opponents, and call for unity, showing how even Christmas was shaped by the country's political divisions. Newsweek contrasted President Trump's Christmas message with those of Barack Obama and Joe Biden, highlighting stark differences in tone and also intent. The analysis contends that Trump combined traditional holiday greetings with partisan attacks and self-praise on Truth Social, while issuing a more conventional message through the White House. It goes on to say that by comparison, Obama and Biden offered brief, inclusive messages focused on family, hope, and unity. The piece underscores how Trump continues to use even holiday messaging to reinforce political divisions and project his governing narrative. The Times, on the other hand, reviews Pope Leo XIV's first Christmas message, highlighting its unusual direct condemnation of conditions in Gaza and his appeal for dialogue to end the war in Ukraine. The report recounts how, speaking at St. Peter's Basilica, the Pope linked the nativity story to the suffering of displaced Palestinians and other vulnerable populations worldwide. The piece underscores Leo's early papacy themes of solidarity with the weak, criticism of war, and moral responsibility, marking a more outspoken and global tone. The Telegraph reported on Prince Andrew's continued exclusion from the royal family's Christmas gathering at Sandringham, underscoring his isolation amid ongoing scandals linked to Jeffrey Epstein. The piece explains that while Andrew spent the day alone near Windsor, his daughters, Princesses Beatrice and Eugene, joined King Charles III and senior royals at the traditional church service. The piece also contrasts Andrew's absence with the public warmth surrounding the wider family, highlighting efforts to protect the monarchy's image while reaffirming support for his daughters. And we'll stay in the UK as The Independent published a new poll delivering a damaging verdict on Prime Minister Keir Starmer, showing deep unease within his own party. The poll, which was commissioned by The Independent, shows around 38% of Labour voters believe the party would perform better at the next election if Starmer were replaced, compared with just 13% who think it would do worse. Now, the poll also shows Andy Burnham emerging as the most popular alternative leader, highlighting growing pressure on Starmer amid speculation of internal challenges. French media focused on budget deadlock, reporting that Parliament passed a stopgap special law after failing to agree on the 2026 budget. Coverage stresses political fragmentation, delayed reforms, and uncertainty as debates are pushed into January. Le Monde's editorial had something to say about this, as it sharply criticizes France's growing budgetary paralysis following President Macron's 2024 dissolution of the parliament. It also argues that reliance on a stopgap special law for the 2026 budget reflects deep political fragmentation, and it also risks normalizing dysfunction. The article warns that prolonged deadlock fuels public mistrust, democratic fatigue, and strengthens extremist currents ahead of the 2027 presidential election. And we'll end in the Middle East as Israel Hayom examines growing internal divisions inside the Trump administration ahead of talks between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, focusing on Gaza, Iran, and the West Bank annexation. The piece indeed highlights evangelical pressure in Washington, which is pushing Israeli sovereignty over parts of the West Bank, even as U.S. public support remains limited. It also explains that a split has emerged between pragmatists like Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner and hardliners led by Marco Rubio, revealing competing visions for regional strategy and conflict resolution. That's it for today. Thanks for watching the Dailies, only on Al Arabiya English.